Okay, today we're going to look at Curley, and so what you need is a copy of Mice and Men in front of you, somewhere that you can make some notes, and by the end of it you're going to have like a whole essay plan that you can use if you're writing about Curley in the exam. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is just look at the description of Curley when we first meet him. In my copy it's page 46, and we're just going to read a little bit from there just so we can see how Steinbeck introduces him. It says, at that moment a young man came into the bunkhouse, a thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man? He asked. The swamper said, that's Candy speaking. He was here just a minute ago, Curly. Went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new man, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? There's a few things that we can get from that. Firstly, I think you can actually make a point about his hair, so it seems to be where he gets his nickname from, doesn't it? And the hair is described as tightly curled hair. Now, I think to me that those tight curls, it's almost like the coils of a spring, and it really seems to fit in, I think, with the way that Steinbeck represents Curly. It's almost like as if he's this kind of coiled spring that's about to kind of, that's really tense. And to me, it emphasises this idea that he's about to snap, he's about to pounce, he's kind of poised for action at any moment. So the tightly curled hair, it's like as if he's this tightly coiled spring that's about to snap or about to be released in some way. He also talks about him wearing high-heeled boots. Now that's interesting because it's like his dad, like the boss. It says he wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. Now, the boss wore high-heeled boots. If you remember in chapter 2, it also says, to prove that he was not a labouring man. To prove that he was not a labouring man. So the reason why they're wearing these high-heeled boots is that, firstly, they wouldn't wear those boots if they were kind of working in the fields, because it kind of like they'd be hard to walk on and so on. So these high-heeled boots prove that, I don't need to get my hands and my feet dirty, kind of like sort of working in the fields, doing agricultural work, because I'm above you. And of course the high-heeled boots also make them seem higher, and Curly is actually quite short, and so he maybe feels quite insecure about that, so he's kind of trying to sort of physically raise himself up as well, isn't he, and make himself physically taller than the men in order to assert his status and assert his power in some way. While we're on that note, it's worth thinking about how does Curly have any power and have any status on the ranch. And in that respect, one of the things I think you could jot down is that he's the polar opposite to Slim in that respect. He's a complete contrast to Slim, because Slim has power through respect, doesn't he? Everyone respects Slim. He has some kind of sort of, he's the leader of the team, okay, but really everyone respects him. His opinions are law. Because of who he is, because he has this sort of sense of, he has this sort of almost like regal, royal nature about him. He's described as the prince of the ranch, isn't he? Everyone just respects him because of who he is, and because of what he says, and the way that he acts, and the way that he behaves. But Curly has power through threat and physical aggression and intimidation and abuse, doesn't he? And so therefore Curly's power is more fragile. Slim's power is secure and stable. It would take a lot to break that. Whereas Curly's power is always kind of like a little bit on edge, a bit like that of a bully, basically, because a bully only has power as long as you let them have it. Whereas the moment you stand up to a bully, the power is shattered, isn't it? Of course, he also has power by association, is what I call it. Power by association, because he's the boss's son. So he can constantly threaten to get someone sacked, can't he? That also places Curly, though, I think, in quite a difficult position. So one of the things I would say about Curly is that, he's not described in a very sympathetic light. As readers, we don't warm to him, do we? We don't think of him as in a positive light. We don't view him, as a character that we sympathise with, because he's constantly so vile and hostile and aggressive to other people, isn't he? But maybe we need to think, well, what's at the root of that? And I think at the root of that is insecurity, isn't it? And I kind of wonder whether part of the thing with Curley is that he feels very insecure, maybe because he hasn't really got a place on the ranch. Do you know what I mean? He's not the employer, he's not the boss, nor is he one of the workers. He doesn't really have a role. He's just the boss's son. And so part of, I think, the way in which he interacts with all the other men and constantly trying to prove himself and trying to assert himself, it's like as if he's struggling to find this position, to establish some kind of role, some sort of status, some sort of position, because he doesn't really know where he stands. He's not the employer, he's not one of the men, and that places him, I think, in kind of quite a vulnerable position. And that's at the root of, I think, a lot of his insecurity, which leads to this very aggressive behaviour. So I would jot down something about that. His fight with Lenny at the end of chapter 3, of course, is also really important, isn't it? And I'm just going to read a little bit from that. So in my copy, it's page 89. At the bottom of page 89, it starts. And it says, the door opened. Slim came in, followed by Curley and Carlson and Whit. Slim's hands were black with tar and he was scowling. Curley hung close to his elbow. Curley said, well, I didn't mean nothing, Slim. I just asked you. Slim said, well, you've been asking me too often. I'm getting goddamn sick of it. If you can't look after your own goddamn wife, what do you expect me to do about it? You lay off of me. I'm just trying to tell you I didn't mean nothing, said Curley. I just thought you might have saw her. Why don't you tell her to stay the hell home where she belongs, said Carlson. This is Carlson joining in now. You let her hang around bunkhouses and pretty soon you're going to have someone on your hands so you won't be able to do nothing about it. Curley whirled on Carlson. You keep out of this unless you want to step outside. Carlson laughed. You goddamn punk, he said. You tried to throw a scare on Slim and you couldn't make it stick. Slim throwed a scare on you. You yellow as a frog belly. I don't care if you're the best welder in the country. You come for me and I'll kick your goddamn head off. Now, notice Slim has stood up to Curley, hasn't he? And he's saying, I'm fed up of you asking me where your wife is. Just shut up. Okay. Now, Carlson has stood up to him and said, maybe you better, if you're so paranoid, maybe you better keep your wife at home. Okay, because we're all fed up of you constantly accusing us of spending time with your wife. Okay, and Curley tries to threaten Carlson and says, you keep out of this unless you want to step outside. Carlson completely calls his bluff, doesn't he? And says, yeah, really? You want to fight? I don't care if they're the best welder in the country. You come for me and I'll knock your goddamn head off, he says. Okay, you really want to fight with me? Okay, I'm up for that. Okay, so Slim has stood up to him. Carlson has stood up to him. Okay, look what happens now. Now it says, Candy joined the attack with joy. Glove full of Vaseline, he said disgustedly. Curley glared at him. So Slim has stood up to him. Curley might recover from that because Slim is kind of like, obviously everyone respects Slim and they realise the power and the status that he has in the ranch. Carlson then stands up to him. Okay, but now Candy stands up to him and publicly humiliates him by making fun of the fact that he's going around with this glove full of Vaseline, which he says he's keeping soft for his wife. Now, the impression we get is that all the men have been talking about this and laughing about it and sort of smirking about it behind Curley's back, but not talking to him about it openly. But the moment Candy says glove full of Vaseline, you can imagine how Curley's feeling. He must be mortified because he kind of realises they've all been making fun of him. They've all been joking about this behind his back. Okay, and so Candy, one of the weakest people on the ranch. Think of chapter 4 when Curley's wife comes in and she says, they left all the weak ones here. And Candy is one of those people. He's old. Okay, he's powerless. Not so much because he's got a stump, because he hasn't got a hand. The lack of the hand symbolises his powerlessness. And this is where we need to do a little bit of a mental shift here. Okay, we need to recognise that Steinbeck is in control of what happens to people's hands. Okay, and Steinbeck uses hands symbolically within the novel. Okay, so yes, okay, on one level, Candy's lost his hand in a machine. Okay, but that's just a superficial, trivial little narrative thing. Okay, really, the reason why Candy hasn't got a hand is because he's old, and because people who are old in 1930s America are powerless and weak and vulnerable. Okay, and hands represent power. okay? Because you physically do things with your hands. You make things, you control things, you work with your hands, you punch people with your hands, you hold things with your hands. Hands represent power, not always, but very often in Of Mice and Men. And so think of Lenny's big hand. Yeah, it's like a paw, isn't it? Because he's huge and he's got like the physical strength of a bear or an animal, hasn't he? Yeah. Candy hasn't got a hand because he's old. Steinbeck decides to not give him a hand. These characters, they're not real people. They are constructs of the author. Okay, so Steinbeck chooses not to give him a hand to symbolise his powerlessness. Now think about this a minute. You've got Curley, who has these hands in fists, who's described repeatedly. One of the words that Steinbeck uses repeatedly to talk about him is handy. Okay, he's handy. He's handy in a fight. Okay, he's handy because he's physically powerful. Okay, so the handy guy, Curley, has just been physically intimidated, physically humiliated by Candy, the man with the stump. So this doesn't make sense, does it? How can the powerful guy who's described as handy be publicly humiliated by Candy, old Stumpy, okay, the powerless guy? This doesn't make sense in terms of how the hands and the symbolism works anymore, does it? And so Steinbeck chooses to get Lenny to crush Curly's hand. It's not really Lenny who does it. It's Steinbeck who does it through Lenny. Because Steinbeck recognises, hang on, I can't have this powerless guy who's only got a stump publicly humiliating Curly, who's got these fists. That doesn't make sense. Okay, I'm going to have to do something now to Curly's hands in order to show that he's been humiliated, that his power, his status, his position within the hierarchy of the ranch, if you like, has been diminished, has reduced. Okay, and so Steinbeck has to kind of like sort that out to redress it. Okay, and so he decides to have Curly's hand being crushed by Lenny's hand, because then Curly is in effect kind of almost reduced, almost down to the level, temporarily at least, almost down to the level of Candy. Do you see what I mean? Candy's got a stump, but he's just publicly humiliated Curly. So what do? We crush Curly's hand. So you've got to show that the crushing of the hand is Steinbeck's way of confirming the humiliation and its loss of power in symbolic terms. Okay? What else can we say about Curly? We could look at the glove full of Vaseline. Haven't we said much about that, have we? I think that's trying to sort of assert himself and to kind of like sort of show off in front of the other men, to kind of display his superiority. What he's basically saying is, I've got a wife. You know, I'm keeping my hands soft for my wife. Okay, and so he's showing that he's got something that the other men haven't got. Okay, again, it's his way of trying to sort of show that he's above them in some respect. What can we say about his relationship with his wife? We could say that it's quite a dysfunctional relationship, can't we? He's very possessive, he's very controlling, he's constantly looking for her. He's very paranoid, isn't he? There's he's in this constant state of tension, not knowing where she is. So yeah, it's a very dysfunctional relationship, very possessive, very controlling. And it's really, in terms of how Curly sees her, he kind of just sees her almost like as a trophy, as a possession, as someone to show off. He's not really interested in her as an individual. One of the things that you could look at, that I was looking at recently in that respect actually, is how he responds when she dies. Because when she dies, and the guys come out, it's interesting that how Curly doesn't really seem to show any tenderness towards her. I know, obviously, his wife has just died and so on, and so how would you react in that kind of situation? But I think it's interesting that it's not Curly that goes over to his dead wife's body. It's Slim. This is, in my copy, it's page 133. So all the guys come into the barn where Curly's wife's body is just lying there in the sort of semi-darkness, and they're all looking at her. And then it says, then Slim went quietly over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near her, and the spell was broken. So it's not Curly that goes over and thinks, this is my wife. Has she died? Is she alive? You know, there's no real, I mean, maybe he's in shock, but there's no desperation to find out whether she's living. There's no tenderness. There's no concern. There's no love. There's no, I don't know, if someone close to you had just died like that, wouldn't you want to touch them? Wouldn't you want to hug them? Wouldn't you want to hold them? Wouldn't you want to, I don't know. There's none of that from Curly. It then says, Curly came suddenly to life. I know who done it, he cried. That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. While everybody else was out playing horseshoes. He worked himself up into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger, and he ran out too. There's no mention of his wife. Still, is there? You know, his focus is not on tenderness and love and concern and grief. His tenderness is on revenge and rage and fury, isn't it? And he actually seems to almost enjoy what's happened. You know, he almost kind of revels in it. Look at it. It says, Curly came suddenly to life. Because to me, it's almost like as if it gives him a role. You know, it gives him an excuse to assert himself physically over someone else. You know, to prove himself, to kill someone, to be violent. And he recognises that he can actually pull the other men on side in that respect as well. Do you know what I mean? He recognises, you know, some big guy's just killed my wife, so I can get these guys with me and they'll follow me and we can all go and kill this guy together. He recognises that, wow, this is an opportunity to kind of be a leader of the men, and to kill this big guy into the bargain. Do you know what I mean? It's all about revenge, all about fury, all about his position, all about aggression. No concern about her as an individual. No sense of personal loss. No, he doesn't desire to have any kind of like intimacy, to just sort of touch her hair or her face or her hand or to hug her or to, it's none of that at all. And so in terms of looking at Curly's relationship with his wife, I would actually look at the moment when she dies and how he responds to that. And I think that's kind of quite interesting. Just give another couple of final things. I think I would talk about his physical movements are kind of quite interesting with Curly, I think. So it talks about, he says, his arms are it says, this is a quote, he says, arms gradually bent at the elbows. Arms gradually bent at the elbows. That's on that passage in chapter 2. And it's like a kind of fighting stance, isn't it? But in many respects, it mirrors the way that his father behaves. I don't know if you noticed, but when the boss was introduced, it's much more subtle when the boss is introduced. It doesn't say that he's got standing like a boxer or like a fighter or anything like that. But at one point with the boss, it says that he takes his thumbs and puts them into his belt buckle like this. Now, the moment you do that, if your arms are down like this, if you put your thumbs into your belt buckle, okay, it pulls your arms out, doesn't it? So the boss does that as a means of kind of making himself seem that little bit more sort of physically intimidating, a bit wider and stockier. Do you know what I mean? We probably all know people that walk a bit like that. Okay, that's what the boss does. Curly does it as well. Arms gradually bent at the elbows. He's in this fighting stance, isn't he? Okay, trying to create this more intimidating presence. What's interesting, I think, therefore, is that he mirrors his father's behaviour. It's learnt behaviour, isn't it? So, yeah, that's stuff about Curly. Focus on his relationship with his wife, the way he stands, the way he's described, the way he moves. A lot of the verbs to do with Curly are really interesting as well. Verbs like lashed, stiffened, squared, jumped. They're all kind of to do with sudden tension and violence and aggression. Always look at the verbs to do with the way that Curley moves. They're very sudden and aggressive and violent. But also look at the fight. Remember we said with Lenny, that's really significant in terms of his power and his position being diminished, and Steinbeck using the crushing of the hand to kind of symbolise that. And make sure when you're looking at his relationship with his wife, make sure you look at that moment where he's there with his wife's dead body, but almost kind of like ignores her. He's just really interested in getting revenge on Lenny at that moment. Great. Make some notes, get a really good mind map and essay plan together, and then you're prepared for Curley in the exam.